This Friday you'll be speaking at a seminar titled Mauritius at Another Inflection Point.
The reason for the seminar was really when Nikhil and we talk a lot, looked at what was evolving in Mauritius and looked at what was happening at the time of the elections. We concluded that the situation today looked awfully similar to what it did in 2004. When a lot of people, the private sector, the parastatal corporations, the governments, etc., seemed to have run out of steam. They had followed and pursued a very successful trajectory up to a point, but then growth was beginning to fall off the charts. The same thing happened in 2004, and at that time Nikhil was head of the NPCC, and he came up with this idea, he and José Poncini, who was the chairman at the time, came up with this idea of, why don't we do something to get everybody together to talk about a problem that we have, which hadn't been done before. And why don't we find a facilitator who would help do this? So I was picked on as the facilitator, and I sort of framed what the issues were. But the real heroes were the people who participated. And we got participation unexpectedly from people we never expected to participate. All the major Franco corporations and groups came. All the major parastatal heads came. The finance minister at the time and the finance minister to be turned up. And that was quite surprising to us, that everybody sort of felt we hit a chord. And after that, we published this thing called the Competitiveness Foresight, and lo and behold, in 2005, the new government almost adopted it as its program. And up to about 2009, it was remarkably successful. After 2009, things went haywire for a number of reasons, both external and internal. And they've kept going haywire.
Are you trying to emulate the brainstorming session that took place in 2004-2005 and produce some kind of a document that will again be a reference to policymakers?
I think this will be a little bit different in the sense that at that time it was NPCC was a quango, a government agency, which had hired me and had participated in putting this thing together. OIM is acting as an agent provocateur in this particular instance and saying, look, Mauritius needs to think again. So the format is not the same. I think that some interesting ideas are bound to emerge. I think hopefully, you know, agencies like yours and the newspapers will pick it up and people will do some thinking. And perhaps the government and the private sector will decide that they need to repeat the competitiveness foresight exercise. And if they want to, we'd certainly be willing to help them.
Competitiveness foresight, existed since 2005. And one of the most important ideas that was central in that document was the idea of openness. After 10 years, how open do you consider the Mauritian economy to be? And what are the other areas, there most definitely are, where we need to do additional progress?
It would be unfair to say that it has not opened up substantially since 2004. And 2004, it was even much more open than it was in 1994 or 1984. So there has been progressive opening up as far as the business sector is concerned. But to a certain extent, opening up is inhibited, for example, by the size of the parastatal sector you have. You have parastatals doing things which they should not be doing anymore, and the private sector should be doing it. And if the private sector was doing it, and it was open for foreign private players, I think you would see a massive change in efficiency, effectiveness, and capability of these corporations. I think that it is time now for the parastatals to be let go. I don't think Mauritius needs parastatals. When you have a country like this and a small government like this, and you have money-making commercial institutions, a large part of government attention is diverted to commercialization rather than to governance. And so government does not do the key things that government should do. Provide security, provide law and order, provide an effective foreign policy, maintain a sensible currency, provide macroeconomic stability. Now, from this point of view, your original point was how much more open is Mauritius? It's much more open, but not open enough. All the laws are open, the books are open, anybody can come and go, but in practice, it is still difficult. Mauritians themselves are not as open to culturally accommodating foreigners as much as they might be. It's very strange because Mauritius is one of the most remarkable microcosms of the world. You've got an absolute, total, microcosmic polyglot, but it's not a melting pot, it's a salad bowl. Even within Mauritius, you've created a politics and a community culture where the communities get along, but they remain separate. In other words, fusion hasn't occurred yet. A genuinely Mauritian identity has yet to emerge. You know what the Franco-Mauritian identity is. You perhaps have 3 or 4 Indo-Mauritian identities. You know what the Creole-Mauritian identity is. You know what the Chinese-Mauritian identity is. But all of these do not fuse into a single Mauritian identity.
You mean to say we're not comfortable enough with ourselves to be comfortable enough with
Exactly. Even within your microcosm, you cannot fuse amongst yourselves. It's going to be awfully difficult to accept foreigners as part and parcel of your community. If you look at Singapore and Dubai, they haven't fused completely, but you think of the wonders of Dubai, where there are about 140,000 Emiratis and now nearly 2.5 million foreigners who actually feel more Dubaians than most Dubaians feel. They've created that kind of culture and climate of total acceptance in an Islamic society. There is no problem of acceptance in terms of culture, etc. Mauritius still has to overcome that threshold. And I think it has to do with how you value your culture, how you protect certain parts of your culture. I mean, I find Hindus from India coming over here and looking at Mauritian Hindu culture and saying, my God, you know, Mauritius has actually preserved Hindu culture of 2 centuries ago. You have 4 channels on MBC, 2 of which are almost entirely in Hindi. And you have imported all this Indian rubbish that you show on TV. Whereas I find Mauritians to be some of the most creative, talented people in the world. And actual Mauritian content on MBC is minimal. My view is if you didn't have MBC and you had a private corporation instead, you would see a lot more Mauritian content and a lot more Mauritian filmmaking, Mauritian documentary making, etc. MBC is sort of like the BBC was in the 1930s. It's stultified, it has no creativity, it has no imagination, and it's feeding the population pap. But when I look at MBC, I can see why the identities are still separate. You have a Creole channel, you have 2 Indian channels, and you have 1 mishmash channel. And there's virtually no English on it at all when you're trying to compete in a global world where English has become an international language.
Would you say that after all these years, openness is still the critical issue that we need to face?
It is critical simply because you're a microdot in the middle of the Indian Ocean and your domestic market is too small for you to survive on. 70–80% of what you live on and what you earn has to come from the outside world. This is true of Hong Kong, this is true of Singapore, this is true of Dubai. You're not a sugar plantation anymore, and you still think of yourself as a sugar plantation. For a 12 billion economy today, your export should be 6.5 billion and your import should be 4.3 billion. If I look at your tourism account, I'm horrified to find it's a net importer. You're importing more to service your tourists than you're earning from export income. Now, I find it difficult to believe that that's true. I think when you sell these packages, a lot of what is derived from packages of tourists who come here is kept abroad. It does not come into the Mauritian accounts.
Had we been on the right track, Mr. Mistry, our growth rate should be averaging 7% minimum.
Minimum.
For the past,
it should be averaging 9.
For the past years.
Yeah.
We're doing half of that for the past years. Had we been on the right track, private sector investment should be soaring. It's actually shrinking.
So is public sector investment, by the way. Investment as a whole is shrinking.
Fundamentally, what change do we need in the economy right now?
Nikhil and I used to argue a lot in the last 10–20 years about whether Mauritius had become a welfare state too early in its development cycle. Okay? And whether it was taking the European model of welfare. And Nikhil tried to convince me then, but he didn't quite succeed, that this was absolutely necessary for social cohesion, etc. Having watched the performance of Mauritius, I'm beginning to buy into his general philosophy, because you have such incredible disparities, if not in income, certainly in wealth ownership in Mauritius, where this peculiar phrase, economic democratization, has been invented, and nobody still knows what it means. Except it really means that we ought to take...
Dead and buried.
Exactly. But my side of the argument, where I think that the Mauritian state has gone too far in terms of the relative balance in the public budget between investment and consumption.
you have been severely criticized actually for your stance on the dismantling, let's call that way, for lack of a better word, of the welfare state.
Actually, I was misunderstood. I never intended to suggest that the welfare state should be dismantled.
Do you still hold the same position? What's your position on the welfare state right now?
I think that the Mauritian welfare state is essential, but it's overdone at its level of income. I would love to see a Mauritian welfare state which is like the European welfare state, but even Europe can't afford it anymore. If you see what's happening to France and Italy, if you want a welfare state, you have to have the productivity to support it. Germany has that, but even Germany may be going over the top. A certain kind of targeting and a certain amount of targeting is sensible, and I wish the Mauritian population wouldn't react to it as if it's a hobby horse word, as if it's something that's fundamental evil. Essentially, at the end of the day, what does it mean? It means that the neediest should get the most. And when you provide public resources unnecessarily to people who do not need it, that is deprived. So in a sense, you're almost arguing against equity. And I don't think anything in a society like this should be taboo. You know, a society like this should be open enough to discuss, put on the table and discuss every single issue without getting into a heated argument. I mean, what Mauritius needs is more light in its arguments and less heat. But the kind of politics you've got always generates more heat and completely obscures the light.
What would you consider as being politically acceptable or socially acceptable changes that we could bring to our welfare state?
It's difficult for me, not being a Mauritian, to say what is socially and politically acceptable here. But I can only put on the table what Mauritians should consider for themselves and reach a conclusion. When you have a society as small as this, as tight as this, and as manageable as this, do you need to provide completely free healthcare to everybody? If there are people wealthy enough to be able to pay for doctor's visits and hospital visits, etc. I'm all for primary and secondary education being free at the point of use, unless you choose to go to a private school. But I'm beginning to ask questions about healthcare, whether that should be completely free at point of use. I don't think Mauritius can afford it. I think that there are other social things like, food subsidies, etc., which need to be looked at quite seriously. I don't think you subsidize energy that much, but if you go for renewables, which I think is a matter of survival in the future, you may need to. There may be a question of subsidizing renewables in order to inculcate and propagate their use. And there are lots of subsidies that are not seen because they're provided through the balance sheets and profit or loss statements of the State Trading Corporation and company and Food Corporation of Mauritius, etc., which are not transparent subsidies. So the extent to which consumption is subsidized on the part of the population through the public purse is a question that Mauritius needs to look at very, very carefully.
What would be the other, we were mentioning that previously, the fundamentals of any reform agenda?
For an economy as small as Mauritius, in a sense, you have to build on what you can do and you've done successfully. Clearly, tourism is always going to be a mainstay. But the tourism product in Mauritius is becoming awfully stale and awfully kind of, how shall I put it, pitched at the middle European classes. And you get tourists over here to come for sun and beach for 2 weeks, but you don't get what I call an additional dollar spend from anything other than staying in a hotel and eating its food. Mauritius, although it has talked about this for 25, 30 years, has really not done much in the cultural arena. Dubai has gone for shopping. How much of that you can emulate for an economy this size when you're not a trading entrepreneur is a question mark. So I would advise against shopping. But other activities, entertainment, gambling, cruise ship activities, which I think you want to start. I think marine tourism is a major growth area. Given the fact that you can't afford to bring 2, 3, 4 million tourists a year here, I would go up the value chain and provide a much higher value-added tourism product than Mauritius does. But tourism will always account for anywhere between 12 to 15% of GDP. And so one needs to constantly look at how to improve that product and how to improve it by letting foreign influences begin to affect the market, which for too long was domestically protected for domestic groups. Offshore financial services, we've just produced a roadmap on where the financial services industry should grow. And that's something I know about because I'm an investment banker. I think that's got enormous potential for the next 20 or 25 years. But it will need people who know what they're doing. And there isn't enough human capital in the domestic financial services industry to enable it to diversify and enable it to grow. Manufacturing I have a problem with, because in the sense, you got into textiles, and for 30 years you've stayed in textiles, even though you've got up the chain. But why only textiles? Why did nobody think of smartphone manufacturing, or peripherals, or accessories? You know, if Thailand has the global market in hard disk drives, there are so many new areas of manufacturing where people over here are simply not open to it. And these new areas of manufacturing really need to be looked at. The fact that Mauritius is not in any of the futuristic areas of manufacturing, especially where you have the manufacturing of what you call embedded IT technology in standard products. All of these things, where you are embedding software into items that go into major hardware, whether it's for cars, whether it's for television sets, there is a whole opportunity out there that Mauritius has never even looked at. And in a sense, this is symptomatic of the ossification of what happens in Mauritius. You go into textiles and you stay in textiles for 30 years and you keep climbing the value chain, but you don't go into anything else. And that surprises me. Why don't you go into anything else? In financial services, you're repeating more or less the same mistake that was made in textiles. That the management companies and the management service companies is the product that Mauritius is selling, and it is not diversifying enough into private banking and wealth management, into asset management, especially for Africa, which is now becoming a favorite frontier market. It's not going enough into selling insurance services elsewhere. The insurance market in Africa is about to explode. And I don't see any Mauritian insurance companies really exploiting that. The one thing that strikes me about Mauritius, when I go to Dubai or Singapore or Hong Kong, and everyone will say those are not comparable, but even when I go to places like India, China, etc., the one thing you notice sometimes is that sometimes the government in Mauritius is more entrepreneurial than the private sector. Many of the initiatives, MOBA, etc., have come from government. And the private sector seems to be a very complacent, ossified, not terribly aggressive dynamic. It's oriented much more towards protecting what it's got rather than going out and conquering the world. I would characterize the basic psychology of the Mauritian private sector, especially at the top end, as trying to protect what they've got rather than going out and really doing things for their own benefit and for that of the country.
Why is that so?
Again, I think I'd need to be a Mauritian resident growing up here to understand quite why this psychology exists, but I think it comes from a plantation mentality. When your basic source of capital is land, your entire dynamic and your entire thought process is to preserve, to protect, to husband, and if you grow, it's by acquiring somebody else's land, not by putting money into some...
Or by developing property on the land that you already have.
Precisely. Oh, exactly. And keeping all of the returns yourself. I mean, one of the arguments I've had, look, I've upset everybody in Mauritius, including the landowners, because I suggested that instead of the residential property tax, which I thought was all wrong, property that is not being transformed rapidly enough should be taxed. And property that is transformed and is worth 10 times more, some of those windfall gains ought to be shared with the budget to allow different land use. Now, the landowners are totally against that, but you expect them to be. If your land as agricultural land today is worth, say, 10,000 rupees an arpent, you know, but tomorrow I give you permission to develop a garden city or a peri-urban area, and your land is worth $500,000. It's not appropriate that you keep the entire difference of 490,000 for yourself. By all means, keep 300,000, but share the rest.
Many in the private sector in Mauritius would actually respond to your criticism by saying that this is the word that they like to use. There are many platform issues in the country. Government commitment and government strategy is not strong enough. We have had a change in government recently. You maybe have had a look at the economic agenda that the government has. Maybe you've had a discussion with our finance minister. By what you know and what you've heard, what you've read of this government strategy, do you think that this argument of, yes, but government is not doing enough, is a valid one?
I think when somebody doesn't want to do something, you always come up with false arguments, and I think this falls into that category. By the way, I'm not sure I'd agree that you've got a new government. You've got a 25-year-old government. Okay, so you've got a different government, but I don't think it's new. And I always worry about going so far back into the future. It's a dangerous sort of thing to do. But saying that, one has to allow for the fact that Mauritians had one of two choices. And in this particular case, I think they made the right one. Because I think that the previous government was going down a completely wrong road, and you don't know whose interests it was serving. It certainly wasn't serving any public interest that was discernible. And I think that the Mauritians made the right choice, that they needed a different government. But I don't see this as a new government with new ideas. I see this as a retreaded government from 25 years ago. I think this government does not seem to me to have any ideas which are big or bold or transformative in the way that the present Prime Minister had big and bold and transformative ideas when he first came into power in the 1980s. But it's difficult, given what he's been through, the mere fact that after being president he had to re-enter active politics in order to save Mauritius from itself was, I think, an interesting gesture, but perhaps constitutionally a slightly questionable one for the future, because it is generally presumed that when you become a president, you have forsworn going back into active politics. However, I think it is very, very important that for somebody who has his credibility as a leader and as an icon, to create around him a government that has genuine credibility.
Does he have one?
Does he have a government that has genuine credibility? I think I will take a risk in terms of saying I don't think so.
Why?
Because these people are all from the past.
Well, there's half of his cabinet which are well, 1/3 of his cabinet which are new members.
You know, I always believe that you need substance and a track record to be effective. There are occasionally people who've never done anything in their life, and you drop them in as being a finance minister and they're very successful. But those may be 1 out of 100.
So you factor out some kind of an underdog factor, some kind of genius that might, Holy Spirit that might blend on the government, and bright ideas that may stem out from, I don't know, brainstorming sessions from Percy Mistries or whoever they might be. Don't you think that we have a 5-year period in front of us?
I would hope that in your very optimistic note you are absolutely right, but I don't believe in things that happen by divine providence or by luck or by good fortune. As you yourself said earlier in a preface, the problem with the world as you see it is that, especially for Mauritius, everything that happens globally matters. It can influence it phenomenally. Even cyclones matter. And, I don't think you have the kind of insurance industry which is geared up enough to cope with cyclone damage and let the Mauritian economy move on, as it should. I would like to think that this team that's been put together by the former president, current prime minister, has the vision, it has the energy, it has the drive, and it has the capability to actually create an agenda and deliver on it. At the moment, I see a lot of slogans. I see a lot of, and by the way, this is also true of India, right now. I see a lot of slogans, but I don't see what amounts to a vision, to a strategy, to tactics, to a program, and to implementation. The first thing I'd like to see here is a politics of unification, because I think Mauritius has now outgrown the politics of division. Even the very basis for voting, the very basis of everything here is, forgive me for saying it, it's a very Bihari style of politics. And Mauritius deserves more.
That's where we come from. Well,
but you have evolved considerably. If you go to Bihar today and you come to Mauritius, you're on a different planet. But your politics is not. And that's the tragedy. That you have evolved, your expectations and your demands and your needs are far greater. And I do not think that Mauritius has the kind of politics it deserves. It needs to have a politics in which political desire and electoral expectation is also translated into domain knowledge and capability. When I look at your cabinet and I look at their domain knowledge and their capability in all their positions, big question marks arise in almost every single case. So when you ask me, am I confident? I'll put it this way. Let's just cross our fingers and hope.
We'll be, of course, I guess, talking a lot about strategy during this seminar. But are long-term strategies still pertinent in the world we are now living in, where crises take place in various forms and remain very unpredictable?
You know, when you looked at the development experiences of the 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of which Mauritius emulated. First, it went for an import substitution strategy, which proved all wrong. Then it went for a structural adjustment program where it did very well, an externally oriented strategy. And now it seems to be lost somewhere in between in terms of what to do. For somebody like me, who's sort of worked around the world, advised 50 or 60 governments, looked at island economies of different types, anything less than 7 to 8% growth for Mauritius is failure. It's non-performance. So for anybody to be satisfied that we're doing 3, 3.2, 3.5, that's okay, it's not. If you grow at 7% in real terms, you're doubling your income every 10 years. Okay? If you grow at 3.5, it's 20 years. Now, if you look at 2 periods, 2 decades, what have you done? You've sacrificed a generation. When you grow at half your potential capability, you're sacrificing the future. Who gets hurt? Not the old guys who are in charge, who've made their money and who will keep making money one way or the other. It's the young who get hurt. They're the ones who don't have the jobs of the future. The kind of old strategy where you pick an industry, like we picked textiles before, you remember? Or we picked tourism, or we picked financial services. The kind of picking a sector strategy may be problematic, because these days governments don't know better than markets do. The Economist about 3 weeks ago pointed out that the 4 great powers in the world are not the United States, Russia, China, or India. The 4 great powers in the world today are Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter. And you might be one of the great powers in Mauritius, given what you're doing. It is in that febrile environment that it's very difficult to imagine what the industry of the future will be and how long it will last. Just look at the equipment you use today. Smartphones didn't exist 10 years ago. From that point of view, this idea of picking winners is not going to work. However, the strategy that will work, and I think governments have to have a strategy, is first, make sure that your macroeconomy is always right. Make sure you don't run budget deficits you can't sustain. Make sure you don't run current account deficits you can't sustain. Make sure you have human resource policies which make sure that your human capital, your social capital, your institutional capital is always up to the mark and not below. And then what happens is very strange. You don't have to go to people, people will come to you. If you're open, if people feel this is a terrific environment in which to thrive, in which to create, in which to be innovative, the industries of the future will gravitate to you. Yes, it is important to have a strategy, but the right broad strategy to always maintain a stable, solid, up-to-the-mark, world-class macroeconomic environment. That's the most important strategy of all.
Let's try to end on the note of hope. Why do you think we can still hope the best for the local economy?
Because I have fundamental faith in Mauritius and Mauritians. I think they're far more capable than they think they are. I think that too much of their energy and time is spent arguing senselessly and fighting with one another instead of coming together and not wasting that time doing what needs to be done. I think there's this question of marshalling the domain knowledge that's needed. I think actually very highly of the kind of people I've met, both in government and in the private sector, apart from those psychological constraints that are embedded in them. I don't think that they're incapable people, but I think that they are caught up in the politics and the dynamics of the past. I don't think they have enough of a sense of the present or of the future, and they certainly don't have the sense that I think every Mauritian urgently needs to feel, from a small child to the Prime Minister, that Mauritius's future and its future economy and its growth depends on what earning it can, what living it can earn from the rest of the world. But as I said several times, the domestic economy is just too small. And so this inculcation, this sense that's, by the way, inculcated in every Singaporean child, that, you know, forget the domestic market, the world is my market. And it's that kind of philosophy that needs to be instilled at the school level, in government, in the Bank of Mauritius, in private corporations, As I said, 2 or 3 things. I earn my living from the world. Anything less than 10% growth for me is not enough, and anything less than 2/3 growth from the rest of the world is not enough. And I think if those kinds of feelings are imbibed, there is enough capability over here to achieve those targets, because they're not unachievable. You know, I mean, these days, to shift your economy from 12 billion to 25 billion in the space of 10 years is eminently doable. I would agree with you that one always needs to be optimistic and one needs to live on hope. It is very clear that the previous government was on a trajectory that would not have delivered it. This government now has the chance to deliver it. It's been put in office. I just hope it does what it needs to do, and it has what it takes to deliver.
On this word of hope, thank you very much, Percy Mistry.
Pleasure.